This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi. Welcome to Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. Does tax policy drive interstate migration? Those observers who contend that taxpayers are so tied to their local economy that a move to lower tax rate states would be impractical and counterproductive must also contend with actual data on outmigration from high tax to low tax states. Indeed, such questions are at the heart of debates here in Massachusetts about the need for tax relief to remain competitive in the wake of a substantial tax increase for high earners. Were the impact of outmigration to be substantial, particularly amongst those with high earnings, the implication would be that much of the revenue expected from higher tax rates could be substantially reduced by the loss in net income. Policymakers must also consider that beyond outmigration's effect on the state's tax base, the outflow of high-income investors and entrepreneurs will mean slower growth and fewer jobs in the state's economy. But how can policymakers know whether tax rates actually drive outmigration for high-earning residents? And if a clear correlation between high tax rates and high outmigration can be established, will the need to compete with other states for talent, investment, and jobs constrain future tax increases and instead militate in favor of offering a lower tax rate to a larger, more prosperous base? My guest today is Pioneer Institute's Economic Research Associate, Aiden Enright, whose recent Pioneer paper entitled Debunking Migration Myths examines Massachusetts migration data over the past decade. He will share with us the magnitude and trends in outmigration in the Bay State and explain which residents are leaving and to which states they are moving. We will explore what can be inferred from his data about the effect of tax policy on migration patterns for high earners in Massachusetts, and discuss how trends towards remote work and the passage of the surtax on high earners may contribute to a decade-long outflow of talent, investment, and jobs from our state. When I return, I'll be joined by Pioneer Institute's Economic Research Associate, Aidan Aldrich. Okay, we're back. This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi, and I'm now pleased to be joined by Pioneer Institute's Economic Research Associate, Aiden Enright. Welcome to Hubwonk, Aiden.
Happy to be here.
Well, I'm thrilled to have you here. I was intrigued by your most recent piece you wrote for Pioneer Institute. It's about a topic we've addressed in earlier episodes. It was called Debunking Migration Myths. We're going to be talking about the fact that your analysis, your research really talks about the way in which folks in the United States may choose to move from one place to another. Specifically, we're talking about Massachusetts. They may live here and decide to move elsewhere. We're going to talk about why they may do that, and we're going to use data from why they have or who it is that's moving, where they're moving, to sort of come up with a pattern of what it is that may make people move, and perhaps what we might be able to do policy-wise to reduce that out migration. So let's start at the beginning and define some terms. You do some extensive analysis on how many people who live in Massachusetts decide to pack up and move to other states. What is the trend right now? Are we getting people in more than we're losing, or is there an out migration?
Well, there's certainly an out-migration. If you look at the history of out-migration in Massachusetts, there have been several different periods where a lot of residents have left the state, some in the 90s, some in the early 2000s. As recently as 2009, Massachusetts as a state gained residents, over 2,000 residents, according to census data. But since then, more and more people have been leaving the state, over 10,000 in 2014 to over 46,000 in 2021. Since the pandemic started alone, we've lost over 110,000 residents.
So yeah, we do know that, particularly relative to our other states. I'll note that we lost a congressional seat 10 years ago, and that was largely by, when we used to be one of 13 states, we were very important, and now we've got 9 congressional seats out of 435. So relative to the rest of the country, we're becoming a smaller and smaller share. Your numbers suggest that those rates of outmigration are accelerating. Is that true?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Just in the last few years, we've lost 110,000 residents. Just as I mentioned before, there were periods or years beforehand in the early 2000s, around the Great Recession, that we actually gained residents. And since then, we've been continually losing more.
All right. So to complete that picture, where are our former Bay Staters moving to?
Overwhelmingly to states like Florida and New Hampshire, even to some extent Texas and North Carolina and some other New England states. But over 50% of all the the net tax filers leaving the state are going to New Hampshire and Florida.
You mentioned New Hampshire and Florida, two very, very different states. One's colder, one's a lot warmer. A lot of people want to say, well, people want to move for palm trees and orange groves, but New Hampshire has neither of those. What do the states you just mentioned have in common, if not weather?
Yeah, like you said, New Hampshire and Florida are very different states, completely different. What they do have in common are that they have very low tax burdens compared to other states. Specifically, they don't have income taxes or estate taxes, which other states like Massachusetts and Connecticut do.
I want to cite from your paper when we talk about New Hampshire. If we imagine it's one of the New England states, but the one with no income tax, in your paper you cite that of over the two and a half billion that Massachusetts lost in net adjusted gross earnings income in 2020, 71% went to New Hampshire and Florida. But just looking at New England, Massachusetts lost 870 million in net AGI to New Hampshire, and only 587 million to the other four New England states combined, meaning it's not just a random outmigration, it's entirely concentrated on those with low or no income tax. Is that right?
So you would expect that all things being equal, there would be kind of a level playing field for outmigration. But uh, because New Hampshire has such a competitive tax environment, we're seeing a lot more tax filers go there instead of other states with higher tax rates.
So I want to go beyond the scope of your paper that just focused on Massachusetts and say, in general, when we look at all 50 states, do we see a general trend whereby states with high tax regimes experiencing high out migration, and those with low tax regimes seeing high in migration? Is there a general national trend if your analysis has gone that far?
Certainly, if you look at states with high taxes like California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, they're all experiencing a lot of the same trends that Massachusetts are, where they're losing a lot of residents. But then if you look at other states with low tax burdens, say the states without an income tax like Texas or Washington or Florida or New Hampshire, pretty much every state without an income tax is gaining residents compared to losing them.
Now, I want to play devil's advocate. I can imagine a listener saying, yes, but there's another characteristic of those high tax states that they're also high cost of living states. So whereas you're attributing the outmigration to taxes, others might say, look, to buy a house in Massachusetts versus, in the Florida Everglades or in the wilderness of New Hampshire, that's why they're moving. How would you tease out those differences between those who are moving for tax reasons and those moving just for a lower cost of living?
Well, you have to look at the type of residents who are leaving. So if it's just the cost of living, higher income residents can likely, still afford to live in the state, even though, the cost of living is high, while middle income fat tax filers probably can't, or low income or working class. So if you see a large percentage of high income tax filers leaving, then it says that there's something more going on than just that there's a high cost of living.
So that sets up the sort of theme of your paper perfectly, right? So we've said what you've done to analyze largely the effects of a relative taxation on outmigration. What you've done is focused on those earners who you've defined high earners as those who make more than $200,000 a year. And you go a step further and you directly address an assertion made by another think tank called the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities that claims the average annual rate of outmigration as a percentage of higher income taxpayers is lower than many other states. In other words, though we have lots of high income people leaving, our percentage of high earners leaving is relatively low. What is the problem with that kind of analysis? That's saying, look, everybody's losing high income people. Why would we be concerned about Massachusetts?
Well, I would first say that that's kind of a cherry pick statistic. when you look at percentages of different states and the amount of high income earners that they're losing, well, different states have a different percentage of high income earners. So, for example, in that study, West Virginia was one of the states that was losing the highest percentage of 200K plus earners. But West Virginia only has about 2.6% of tax filers that make that kind of income, whereas Massachusetts has almost 10% of tax filers making that kind of income. And so if you're using that statistic, it doesn't, they're trying to make it relative to all states, but it's not in absolute terms because Massachusetts has so many taxpayers. The study also doesn't take into account other areas as well. So it's looking just at the percentage of tax filers leaving, but it's not looking at net migration, and it's also not looking at AGI laws. So if you think about it,
So let me before you mentioned specifically a neighboring state, Rhode Island, as a great comparison of saying, okay, let's assume the same percentage leaves from each state. The characteristics of the percentage of high earners is substantially different. So go into what your paper addresses is specifically Rhode Island. Can you cite those numbers for us?
yeah. So if you take the exact numbers that the CBBP study used, just opposing Massachusetts and Rhode Island, Massachusetts would lose roughly 7,800 tax filers, which would amount to 4.6 billion in income from those tax filers leaving, whereas Rhode Island would only lose 999 tax filers, which would amount to roughly 400 or $500 million leaving their state. And so in absolute terms, Massachusetts would be losing a lot more in taxable income that would translate to revenue for the state.
In other words, the same statistic, again, as you say, a cherry-picked statistic by the CBP, the percentage of high earners who leave would actually have a net effect that is 10 times larger in Massachusetts than it would be in Rhode Island. We're losing similar amounts of high earners, but because we have so many of them, and those high earners make so much money, that now the state has roughly $5 billion in net AGI to effectively tax. Do I have that right?
Exactly.
Why do we care that all this money is going away? I think I want to bring in another pioneer scholar. It was an earlier paper by Eileen McEnany, who noted that those top 1%, now we're talking about not just the 200,000 and above, we're talking much higher income earners. They account for a substantial amount of our tax, meaning though they're small in number, they're large in effect. Do you have the numbers of what percentage of our highest earners, what they contribute to our state's coffers?
I don't have the exact numbers on the total amount of income that they contribute to our state's coffers, but as Eileen cited, 23% of all the revenue for the state comes from those earners. And so you can imagine that even a smaller percentage of those earners leaving the state would, especially when they're not being replaced from inflows and in-migration, are going to have an eroding effect on the state's tax base, which would limit its revenue and its programs.
Yeah, in other words, yeah, the state would have less money to tax on all the things it thinks is worthwhile to spend on. So that would be, let's say, less than ideal. Now, for our more market-oriented listeners, I think there's a lot going on here. We like to think of high earners by their other aliases as people who are generally employers, entrepreneurs, investors, people who create jobs and are largely responsible for our prosperity. Now, your analysis is retrospective. You're looking backwards. The last 10 years, you mentioned there's quite a bit of outflow, but we've gone through a pretty tumultuous last couple of years, a couple of different changes that might even affect those outflow trends. I think we're maybe at an inflection point. There's two things. First, I'll mention, somehow it's made its way into this podcast, the pandemic, of course. It had health effects, but it also had technology effects. A lot more people can now effectively work from home, and those are generally going to be the high information professions. They might be consulting, finance, legal. They can work wherever they like. One has to assume that post-pandemic, those people who had migrated could be even freer than before to continue that trend. Do you think that the post-pandemic effects will accelerate or have very little effect on these trends?
You can certainly expect for some kind of acceleration. It's a valid concern when you're talking about remote work, especially in Massachusetts compared to other states. Massachusetts, about 24% of workers work remotely, while 18% work remotely as a national average. And so taxpayers in Massachusetts are a lot more mobile. They're less tied through their jobs than other taxpayers, and that makes the concern over them leaving a lot higher because of that. You also look at Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a lot of people around the retirement age, and older workers in particular are a lot more likely to migrate than younger workers. And so that's a concern as well.
Indeed. And beyond the pandemic, of course, we've just passed the 4% surtax on income above $1 million. In earlier HubWonk podcasts, we looked at other states who did similar types of tax regimes like Connecticut and California. And in those cases, we have a little more data to look at. We saw many years of outmigration immediately after this increase. And I think Massachusetts voters appreciate if a high earner, someone who makes more than $1 million leaves, they don't take just the 4% that they pay in the surtax. They take with them the 5% they would have paid if they stayed. So there's quite a bit of outmigration. Your paper suggests that the tax regime could lead to a net loss of revenue in the order of $5 billion over 10 years. Do you think the millionaires tax will accelerate that out? Will make that number bigger?
Certainly, and I think the statistic that you're referencing is the amount of net AGI or adjusted gross income lost since 2012 in Massachusetts. And so one of the things that makes Massachusetts different than other states is that there's net outmigration. And so when taxpayers leave, we're not recouping their income through inflows. And so over time, especially if outmigration is accelerating and we're not recouping our losses in inflows, there can certainly be a lot of additional losses for us. So since 2012, we've lost $5 billion just from tax filers with 200K or more in income.
Now, earlier we talked about, you mentioned other states that are with lower tax rates are getting inflows, and high tax states are having outflows. We've read quite a bit, though, that despite Massachusetts' trends towards higher taxes, most states have been trying to adjust their income tax downward. Again, this isn't in the context. Do you have any data on where other states that are changing their tax code, what the general trend nationwide has been as far as tax regimes?
There has certainly been a lot of reforms in other states in order to make them more competitive for earners and businesses. One example is with the estate tax. And so Massachusetts implemented its estate tax in 2006. And we have one of the earliest or the lowest exemption levels for estate tax at 1 million. In other states, a lot of them, even in New England with Vermont and Connecticut, have been raising their exemption levels for that tax. Connecticut doesn't even start taxing estates until at the point of $9 million. And a lot of states have actually gone away with their estate tax or transitioned to inheritance tax, which is less burdensome. You can see that with capital gains as well, where states have made reforms to lower their capital gains rates and their income tax rates. And so they're doing this in order to be more competitive and bring in more earners and more businesses and more investment into their states.
Yeah, it seems that again, we've talked about our new governor, Maura Healey's plan for tax relief. And to her credit, although she identifies as a a progressive governor, she's acknowledged the fact that in order to remain competitive for talent and investment, that a tax relief is necessary, and particularly in the areas you mentioned: estate tax, short-term capital gains tax. Just to perhaps counteract the effects of the millionaires tax. But I think it's a victory where she sees Massachusetts as needing to compete. Do you think that the fact that other states have reduced their taxes is sort of tacitly acknowledge that they, I can't imagine any other reason to lower taxes, that they need to do so in order to remain competitive? Do you see this as sort of acknowledgement of that simple truth?
Yeah, absolutely. The state's going to continue to lose high income earners in business if changes aren't made. And Massachusetts has high tax rates across the board for most areas. And so, if you would start increasing the tax rate on income, and you also have a high tax rate on estates, and you also have a high tax rate on capital gains, then it adds up. And people are going to take that into account, businesses and individuals, when deciding whether or not they want to stay in Massachusetts or leave.
We're getting close to the end of our time together. Again, I appreciate your coming on the show and talking about your paper. I want to ask your opinion on this view. And in reading your paper, it occurred to me, defenders of higher taxes seem to respond in general with the notion that, well, you know what, higher taxes is what we pay for our higher standard of living, or a better society, a better city, better state. Implied in that is somehow the causation that progressive policies make us prosperous. To me, I see the direction of the causation to be the exact opposite, meaning we are progressive because we're prosperous. We're not prosperous because we're progressive. To me, it seems, our affluence has made us sort of perhaps more civically generous, but we've somehow lost sight of the fact what made us prosperous in the first place. I would assert that Massachusetts has a long tradition of valuing hard work, temperance, education, family institutions, these sort of things. That's what makes us prosperous. We're prosperous despite our policies, not because of them. What are your views of the relationship between policies and prosperity?
Yeah, I think I would agree with a lot of your assumptions there. And you look at states that are bringing in, or trying to make reforms to bring in a lot more business investment and create wealth for their residents. And at the same time, our state is kind of rolling it back and creating an incentive for people to leave, and which is going to affect the tax base, which is going to affect the services that we provide. And the only reason that we were able to get to this point is because of our economic competitiveness, our businesses, our universities, and it's not policies, high tax policies, that have allowed for our state to be so competitive and so economically well off.
Indeed, and I remember, I'm old enough to remember when we used to be called Taxachusetts. I think we're dangerously close to earning that label once again. For our listeners who are intrigued by your research and want to learn more, where can we find your work at Pioneer?
You can find my work in the economic opportunity section on the website. There should be my paper. There's also another paper by Aidan McNanny on outmigration as well.
Yeah, I think they both make a terrific case. Again, we'll say wait and see, but let's hope that the policymakers, the legislators, perhaps the governor listening to the show are bolstered by our argument that if we care about the prosperity and the well-being of all our Massachusetts residents, be they middle income, higher income, or millionaires, everyone is served by a competitive, friendly tax regime. You don't make poor people rich by making rich people poor. It actually works in the other direction. So thank you for joining us today on HubWonk, Aiden. You've been a great help.
Absolutely.